And get started. This is Megan and Alan with the National Weather Service office in Bismarck for our Spring and Summer Outlook webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So feel free to type your questions into the GoToWebinar question box, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you at the end. For any media requests, I've got our phone number on the screen as well as our personal emails. We will be here the rest of the day, so feel free to ask us any questions after this webinar if they don't get answered at the end. So we will get started. Like I said, this is Megan and Alan. I'm one of the meteorologists on station. Alan is the hydrologist. And we're going to talk a little bit about the spring and summer outlook for western and central North Dakota, and we'll also get into the fall and maybe a little bit of a hint at what is to come for the next winter season. So looking back to the outlooks that we talked about back in October for our winter outlook, the temperature outlook is on the left, precipitation outlook is on the right. We were favored to be colder than normal and more active than normal because of the La Nina conditions ongoing. And we will be upfront, this winter has not quite gone the way that we thought it would. It's definitely been an up and down winter. So looking at our temperatures, just the average temperature is on the left, and then on the right is the departure from normal. This is for December 1st through February 28th, so the meteorological winter season. You can see, looking at the departures on the right, really the only part of the state that was even close to normal, maybe slightly below normal, was kind of the far north central into the northeast and the far east. But the majority of western and central North Dakota, especially looking towards the southwest, was certainly above average. And the southwest part of the state, you're getting into 4 to 6 degrees above average. So even though we did have those La Nina conditions, they were pretty weak, and it ended up not having the influence that we thought it would have on the temperatures. So we did not see those cooler temperatures that we were expecting. Precipitation, on the other hand, was pretty up and down. This is, again, the accumulated precipitation from December 1st to February 28th on the left, and then the percent of normal is on the right. So you can see sort of the percentage of above or below normal. And you can see, just looking at the percentages, any of this green shading is in 100 to 125% of normal, kind of that light green. Getting a little bit darker green is 125 to 150%. So a lot of the west and into the central, and then into kind of the Turtle Mountains area, and then over to Grand Forks, had above average precipitation. You get a little bit drier in the southern James River Valley as well as in the far northwest. But overall, there were certainly precipitation was around this whole winter, but paired with the warmer temperatures, we did start to see a lot more rain events. We did have some mixed precipitation events, some freezing rain events, as well as the typical snow events. So we did get a little bit of everything, but even with those warmer than normal conditions, we did manage to get a good amount of precipitation that we were expecting. Then looking at the seasonal snow so far, this is the seasonal accumulation from Norrisk. And I will be upfront that we do think this section in the south central part of the state is a little bit high based on their analysis. We're not entirely sure why, but it does seem to be a little higher than it should be. You can see that red is in the 48 to 72 inches. I would expect, if anything, it's on the very low end of that range. Right now, Bismarck is at 40.7 inches on the season, which season to date is actually only about an inch below normal. So seasonal snow-wise, we're doing pretty good, which again is kind of surprising. It doesn't really feel like it, just because, as we've talked about, and as I'm sure people have noticed, our season has been very up and down, where we get snow and then it melts off, and then we get more snow and then it melts off. But just numbers-wise, we have actually gotten about as much snow as we would on average. A little bit lower out to the west and to the north, but overall, snow amounts, and again, we just looked at precipitation amounts, have not been too bad through the winter season so far. So as we look ahead to what we're expecting for the rest of the spring and the summer and into the rest of the year, we talk every time about the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the large-scale climate pattern based on sea surface temperature anomalies in the Pacific Ocean. The warm phase is El Nino, the cold phase is La Nina. This is the main thing we have to work with any sort of extended outlooks beyond a month or two. It is the longest and most skillful predictability. So we use it a lot, as you know, since we talk about it on all of these webinars. Right now we are coming out of a La Nina. We're coming out of that cold phase. And again, we didn't quite see the temperatures that we expected with that but it was a pretty weak event, so it did lower the probability that we saw the expected patterns. Again, you can see the La Nina conditions. Typically, we end up a little bit colder, and you can see on the right is just a chart of the relative sea surface temperature anomalies. You can see they were in that negative 0.5 to negative 1 range, which is just a weak La Nina event. So again, it makes it a little bit less likely that we see the expected outcomes of it. But you can also see things have been warming in those specific regions of the Pacific Ocean as we start to transition out of those La Nina conditions. As we look ahead month to month through the spring, typically when we are in a weak La Nina, kind of coming out of a weak La Nina, for March and April, that does favor us historically for colder than normal temperatures before we see a pretty strong warm signal in May. So again, for March, it has been very up and down. Obviously, today is going to be quite mild as we are approaching some record high temperatures across the western central parts of the state. But it has also, it's going to be cooling down on Sunday as a strong front comes through. So it is just pretty variable, but that is typically what we see. But then again, in May, you really start to break out of that and get closer to, near normal, if not above normal temperatures as we start to approach meteorological summer. For precipitation, certainly weaker signals. The one that always stands out is in that middle frame in April, just looking at some of the composites of past events where we're in a weak La Nina, but there is some signs of a wetter pattern specifically in April before we start to dry out across the eastern part of the state in May, as well as that warm signal that we just looked at. So as we look ahead for the next couple of weeks as we go through meteorological spring, the 8 to 14 day outlook that came out yesterday, you can see slightly favored for warmer temperatures across most of the west and south. Not too much of a precipitation signal. So again, just that pretty variable, could be large spreads in temperatures from the northeast corner of the state to the southwest, which does happen a lot. As we look further ahead, this outlook is a little outdated. Our 3 to 4 week outlooks only come out every Friday. So this is from last Friday, but valid for the very end of March into the first 10 days of April. Favored for above normal temperatures with no strong tilt in the precipitation outlook, which is on the right. So again, a little bit milder than we would expect, but I would also suspect that it will probably be pretty up and down and just continuing the pattern that we've been seeing for the last couple of weeks. The new outlooks did come out this morning. They were just released, so this is the brand new April outlook, and it does not give us a whole lot to look at, which is also not surprising. The monthly temperature outlook on the left, the far southwest corner of the state just being clipped for a slight tilt towards above normal temperatures, but most of the state is in that equal chances category, which just means that there's nothing really tilting us one way or the other for above, below, or near normal temperatures. And to me, that again is the same thing we've been saying, that we are expecting the very variable pattern to continue with up and down temperatures, and eventually it'll even out to something maybe close to normal, but really not a lot of consistency through the month. And then the precipitation outlook on the right, you see a little bit more of an active signal for the eastern part of the state and then further into Minnesota, but most of the state of North Dakota is still in that equal chances category. So again, some shots of precipitation definitely to be expected, but as of right now, we haven't seen anything that would indicate any sort of large storm system, at least in the next couple of weeks. So as we look ahead to what's going to happen in the summer and then further on into the fall, the ENSO forecast is quite definitive. So these blue bars that you see in this graph are the La Nina probabilities, the gray bars are ENSO neutral, and then the red bars are La Nina. And then on the bottom, you can see the 3-month season. So FMA is February, March, April. MAM is March, April, May, and so on. So as we quickly get into March, April, May, we are expecting the La Nina to be ending as that sea surface temperature region starts to warm up, and we go into ENSO neutral conditions, very high probabilities. Those don't last too long, though, as you look towards May, June, July, and then June, July, August, which is meteorological summer, that our probabilities for El Nino conditions quickly increase as we look through the fall and getting close to the winter season. The spring is always kind of tough. There's the spring predictability barrier, so a little bit of uncertainty, but with these probabilities at this time of year, that tells me that there's pretty high confidence that we're going to be switching to an El Nino. Still some questions on the strength, of course, but right now there is a 1 in 3 chance that this El Nino would be strong. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean stronger impacts. It just means more likely that we're going to see the expected pattern that we see with an El Nino. So again, pretty high confidence that we're going to be flipping to an El Nino within the next couple of months into the summer. So then we start to look at the summer, just looking at some composite years of when we went from ENSO neutral conditions to an El Nino. These are monthly temperature anomalies, June on the left, July in the middle, and August on the right. And you can see that there is a pretty consistent signal across the northern plains, along with a lot of the continental US. And I would say that this is just a slight cooling signal. If you look at the legend on the bottom, that it's not very strong, but it is certainly there and it is consistent. So that is something to think about, just as, you know, depending on when we transition from ENSO neutral to El Nino conditions, and those effects can be lagged a little bit as well. And as we see with the outlook, it maybe doesn't agree with that. But that is something to keep in mind, that depending on when we go into those El Nino conditions, that could influence at least a little bit our summertime temperatures and keep them potentially a little bit more moderated. For precipitation, a little bit more variable, as summer precipitation always is. Generally, there's a dry signal across the eastern part of the state in June. That's on the left. In the middle, you start to see more of a dry signal for July. Before August, there are some hints, at least in previous years with a similar pattern, of a little bit more of an active signal. So again, it is going to be very dependent on when we transition to the El Nino conditions and what that looks like. But historically, this is what we've seen with some previous similar events. So for the rest of spring, as we get into our new seasonal outlooks that just came out this morning, temperature is on the left. This is valid for April, May, June. Again, not a whole lot to look at for the state as a whole. You start to see a pretty significant warm signal out across parts of the western US, which is something to think about, because that is also where there's a pretty good dry signal. But for North Dakota, you're getting a little bit of a tilt towards above normal temperatures for the southwest part of the state. But for precipitation, not too much to go off of just yet. When we go ahead a couple months and look for summer, which is June, July, August, we do start to see that warm signal expand across North Dakota. Lower probabilities to the east, higher probabilities just across the border into Montana. So again, that's a little bit different than what you may typically see as you transition into an El Nino in the summer, but this will probably also be very dependent on soil moisture and how that looks, which Alan will talk to us about just in a little bit. And then the precipitation outlook, again, no strong signal for North Dakota specifically. There is some signal across portions of the Central Plains getting up into South Dakota, as well as in the Pacific Northwest. So we'll have to see how that looks in the next couple of months to see if that shifts at all. But for now, no strong precip signal for North Dakota this summer. Of course, the summer trends the past 30 years, there has been a warming trend, strongest in June and July, and then the precipitation trend is a little bit more variable, comes across a little bit drier when you're looking at the full 30-year period, although recently it has been a little bit wetter, and there also is a bit of a wet signal in August, which we did also see in those El Nino composites. So if anything, that's what I would be looking out for. That seems to be the most consistent signal, is August being a little bit wetter than the other summer months. Then as we look to fall, we start to lose that warm signal, which is a little bit different than the past couple of fall seasons we've had. You can see that for the western part of the state, a slight tilt towards above normal temperatures, but nothing too significant. Pretty large area of equal chances for much of the central US. And then a precipitation outlook on the right is really not a lot to go off of for most of the country. So that tells me that there's really just not a lot in our guidance right now to point us one way or the other, besides the Pacific Northwest, where there's a little bit of a dry signal out there. But for North Dakota, not much just yet. Again, looking at those fall trends, we know that it has been warming through the fall season for the past 30 years. We've also seen that the last couple of falls when we have those La Nina conditions, that amplifies the fall warming signal. It is the opposite with an El Nino, so that's where it gets tough to figure out at this lead time which signal is going to end up being the dominant one. And then for the precipitation trends, a little bit wetter across western parts of the state, but otherwise not too strong of signals. So also just looking at El Nino, I always like to show these. This is the risk of extremes. So you can look at these for both temperature and precipitation based on El Nino or La Nina. This is valid for August, September, October, so kind of late summer into the fall. And you can see that regionally there is a much stronger risk for cold extremes, which is certainly different than what we typically see and feels a little counterintuitive, but I think that's the influence that we see sometimes with an El Nino, is that we end up a lot cooler in the late summer and into the fall, compared to when we have a La Nina or an ENSO neutral, where the long-term trend ends up dominating, which is much warmer. So I would suspect that late summer and into the fall, we could be seeing a much more gradual transition to kind of fall and maybe even winter temperatures, compared to what we've seen the past couple of years or what we see typically. On the right is the precipitation risk of extremes. Not too much to look at there, maybe a little bit of a wet signal to our west and well to our south, but not much of a signal, especially compared to the temperature risk of extremes. When we're looking at weak to moderate El Nino years, this is valid for the fall. Again, you do start to see that cool signal, which is why the CPC outlook looks the way that it does with the equal chances, because you're fighting the long-term trend versus El Nino is typically going to skew you a little bit cooler in the fall. Also skews you a little bit drier. So I would be curious to see over the next couple months if we end up seeing this dry signal show up in any sort of extended model guidance, because that is something to look out for, is that it might be a little bit cooler, but also might be a little bit drier. So that's something to keep in mind as we look well ahead towards the fall. And then finally, just some typical El Nino winter impacts, because this is looking pretty likely. Typically, we are going to see those warmer than normal temperatures. You can see this figure on the left, the November, December, January temperature, increased risk of warm or cold extremes. So we just looked at that for the late summer and into the fall, where it was the cold extreme. Is quite the opposite during the winter. And I don't have the new CPC outlooks in this presentation, but you can go find them online, and they are certainly looking warm for basically all of next winter, 5 or 6 months straight. So that is something to keep an eye on. The last El Nino was in 2023 and 2024. For those who don't remember, that is when we had a pretty significant ice storm for central and eastern parts of the state. So that's already something on our mind, as the El Nino starts to look more likely. That looks like a pretty different winter season for us, even compared to what we had this year. So again, just to summarize, we are really expecting more of the same over the next 4 to 8 weeks. Up and down temperatures, occasional shots of moisture, nothing too crazy, at least for right now. Summer is favored for warmer than normal temperatures, but it's probably going to be influenced by the progression of this El Nino that's coming, as well as by soil moisture. And then in the fall, we do start to see opposing signals from the upcoming El Nino versus the long-term trend. So kind of hard to see what could be the dominant factor, but we will keep an eye on things over the next couple of months. So that's what we have from the climate side, and I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Okay, well, appreciate that, Megan. It's awfully a lot of information to digest, and I love the way you break it down for us. So again, welcome everybody. I'm Alan Schlag. I'm the hydrologist here at the National Weather Service office in Bismarck. And let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing hydrologically across the state. Currently, we have very little drought designations in North Dakota. We've had this little unusual or abnormally dry spot in the eastern part of North Dakota. That's been pretty persistent in the pattern. But typically speaking, when we're in the snow accumulation season, we tend to be very conservative in making quick knee-jerk reactions to any weather event when it comes to the drought monitor. So it's been pretty stable over the course of our meteorologic winter. And I think that's going to hold true again for at least another couple of 3 weeks. Once we get through the spring melt season, then we'll start having a much better idea as to where we stand going into the growing season, which is really, of course, the big critical time of the year for the U.S. Drought Monitor in North Dakota. So let's look at the soil moisture real fast here. So we're going to look here at the volumetric soil moisture. That's actually how much water is available in the soils, and it's basically expressed as a percentage of the mass of the soil. So what we see here is that, as you would probably expect, typically the southwestern part of the state, which I often refer to as our desert southwest, has lower total soil moisture values than what we see in the northern, central, and eastern part of North Dakota. That is not unusual. So this just kind of gives you a rough estimate of what is totally available out there. Then we start looking at soil moisture percentiles. And this is how much soil moisture do we have in the soil currently compared to this date in history in previous years where this information was available. And in that example, when we look at just the upper few inches, the upper 4 inches of the soil horizon, we really only see deficits along our Montana and South Dakota border, again, south and west of the Missouri River and Lake Sakakawea. And once you start getting farther north and farther east, especially above I-94, we start seeing relatively plentiful or at least normal soil moisture, and in some places fairly wet soils in that upper crust. If you would have looked at this graphic just a few short weeks ago, it would have had almost all of North Dakota very dark blue. And the reason for that is because we had early melts this year, right? Megan had already talked about how we've had this up and down winter. We've received our moisture this year. We just never retained it in the form of snow on the countryside. Okay, so we've gotten that moisture, and when it has melted off, we have certainly wetted up the upper 4 inches or so of our surface. And in doing so, like I say, just a couple of weeks ago, this map was extremely blue. But as we're now getting farther and farther along into March, the amount of soil moisture we have in the ground becomes a little less remarkable, simply because in some of the years prior to now, we have seen the full spring melt take place before now, and we were kind of a muddy mess across the state. Now we have a little bit of tempering of that effect, but we are approaching near normal for the vast majority of North Dakota. Here we look a little bit deeper into the soil moisture profile, and on the left you see some reds again, fairly consistently across North Dakota. We see the volumetric water content. And then when we look at the right-hand image here, again, we're looking at percentiles. And in this example, the southwestern part of North Dakota really stands out with a lot of blue. So in that sense, when we're talking about agricultural impacts and to native vegetation, it sure looks like the southwestern part of North Dakota is set pretty well for going into this growing season here over the next several weeks. Then we see a little bit of blue in that north central. You go from roughly Sakakawea on up into the Turtle Mountain area. There's a little bit of a soil moisture plus in that neck of the woods as well. And you don't see the dry in the soils until you get out into more eastern North Dakota, basically from the James River Basin out east through the Cheyenne and on into the Red River Basin. So where you look at in the soil is fairly important in this because it depends on what interest you have in soil moisture. The upper 4 inches of the soil is really important to me when it comes to the spring melt season, because if that is wet and cold, frozen, it becomes a near impermeable surface for our snow to melt and infiltrate into the ground. But what we do see here is that there is room if we can get down below that wet upper crust. Okay. Whoops. There we go. Get a grip here, Alan. So let's look again at the deeper root zone, 0 to 200 centimeters. This goes down quite a ways. That's about 7 or plus feet. But there are, of course, a lot of crops out there, corn and being a good one, for example, that will send its roots down 8 to 10 feet. And once again, we see south and west of the Missouri River and Lake Sakakawea, fairly abundant soil moisture. So again, this leads once again to my optimism that at least in the southwestern part of the state, they're going to get a good start to their growing season, kind of regardless of what we get for precipitation over the next several weeks. And again, north central, they're looking pretty decent. They're at least average to slightly above average. But then when you start getting into the southern James River Basin and again on over into the Cheyenne and Red River Valley neck of the woods, we see this deeper soil moisture becoming somewhat of a deficit with some areas approaching high concerns. And this will come into play later on when we talk about the potential for future drought. So now let's look at soil temperatures. We've talked about the moisture, and again, to me, it's really important when we look at soil temperatures and combine that with the amount of available water, because it tells me roughly how permeable is that soil. And not surprisingly, our desert southwest, so we look at Amadon, Beach, Bowman, that whole neck of the woods, we are seeing nearly frost-free soils at this point. Okay, so those soils are open, they're available for business. If we were to get an incoming rainstorm, we would see a pretty fair amount of that water soak into the ground. However, when you start getting into more central North Dakota, even here in the southern part of the state, Mandan, Ellendale, Jamestown, we see frost depths that are 24 to 31 inches. So they're still fairly well frozen soils. Any water that does get down into there will obviously freeze when it comes in contact with below freezing. So this is the depth to temperatures above freezing. And then we look into the very northwestern part of the state, Williston, a little bit surprising here, but they're relatively losing their frost depth in a hurry. And that's not surprising. We're seeing this throughout western North Dakota and on over into Montana, where they've only got 4 inches of frost depth at some locations in that Williston area. And that is somewhat unusual for this time of year. However, you get a little bit north of Williston into the Fortuna and on east over into the Mohall-Bottineau area, we see some fairly impressive frost depths, okay, all the way down to 49 inches in the Mohall area before you start finding above freezing temperatures. And that's a little bit of a problem because we know that the soils are exceptionally cold up there. We also know that while they don't have a lot of snow on the ground right now, but I would say this area is somewhat susceptible to any type of heavy spring rain event. You know, if you listen to the news, you pay attention to our webpage or stuff, you start hearing our meteorologist talking about an upcoming warm Colorado low. That would be a primary concern for this area. Colorado lows tend to bring a lot of moisture, and if it comes as rain and it hits this hard frozen ground, that can be a bad deal. It would be surprising to those out there as to how much runoff can be generated from liquid rain falling on the ground right now. And then again, you get down into the Hertzfield and Garrison area, you know, they're much more similar to the Bismarck area where we have 20 to 24 inches of frost depth. And again, those are not particularly unusual numbers for this time of the year. And I think over the next several days, as we're going to be 70 degrees across parts of North Dakota, that will certainly be starting to play on the soil temperatures. We're going to start seeing the surface of the ground thaw. You might still have a pretty solid ice profile or frozen ground profile down to 40 inches in some areas, but we're going to start thawing that surface area with some pretty nice weather here over the next few days. So this really shows a clear pattern across North Dakota. The farther southwest you go, or literally the farther west you go, in like I say by Williston, we're losing frost depth at a pretty rapid rate. And then when you get to the north central and more eastern measuring points, we still have plenty of frozen ground to contend with going through the next several weeks. So here's the current soil temperature. This is from Endon at 4 inches underneath turf. Let me just try and get that out correctly. So underneath the grassed areas, this is what we're seeing. And again, these are surface soil all the way down to about 4 inches. And it really shows in a nice visual pattern, again, where we see those warmer soils that are less of a problem going forward with any kind of precip. And then we start getting colder soils, again, north central and northeastern North Dakota. So now let's look real quickly at snow water equivalent. This is from yesterday. And I have to imagine a good share of a lot of this snow has since disappeared when I took this clip yesterday afternoon. And again, western, roughly 1/3, almost 1/2 of the state is near snow free at this point, or certainly you only have roughly a trace of water equivalent left on the ground. And here in the Bismarck area yesterday, for example, we saw a pretty significant runoff, and it fell off really, really quickly as the countryside ran out of snow. Okay, I have a dam in my backyard, and it had water flowing through it at a pretty rapid rate yesterday afternoon. But by the time I got off work and went home and took another look, you could already tell that the inflows were less than the outflow from the dam, simply because the countryside was quickly running out of water. In the western and central North Dakota, the only place where we have a significant snowpack still is up in that Turtle Mountain area. Okay, lots of trees up there. The sun doesn't always get to hit that snowpack directly very easily. So we are looking at, they're still maintaining this. As of a couple of weeks ago, they were flight lines that were ran up there by our airplanes, and they measured 3 inches or a little bit less maybe of water equivalent still on the ground across that northern portion of the Service River Basin. So now this is important because this is what drains into Willow Creek. So it is the only area currently in western and central North Dakota that we at the National Weather Service in Bismarck are responsible for that still has a significant snowpack. So we're going to continue to monitor that pretty closely over the next several days, as they're clearly going to be having warm enough temperatures up there to where we do expect to start seeing increased runoff, or certainly increased melting of the snow in the Turtle Mountain neighborhood. And we expect that runoff to be generating over the next several days and on into next week. There will be a brief period of a little bit cooler weather right around Sunday, and that will, at a minimum, slow the melt, and that's nothing but a favorable thing at this point. We're going to kick it off up there with gangbusters probably, but then just in a day or two, we're going to slow it down again. Come on, mouse. All right, so spring flood potential in summary. Soils outside of the very southwestern corner of the state, I still consider them to be pretty wet and frozen. And we always have to remember, when that's the case, that makes for a nearly impermeable surface. If you're like me and you've been out walking around lately, even when the snow has been gone, but those nice crisp mornings, you walk out into the grass and you could just tell how hard that ground is underneath your feet. And that obviously enhances runoff from a given melting snowpack or rain event. Outside of the Turtle Mountain area, snow water equivalent is generally less than 1/2 inch at this point, and usually almost maybe a trace right now. The ground is still wet, but it does not have a lot of mobile water remaining on top of the ground. However, the Turtle Mountain area, perhaps locally, still has up to 4 inches of snow water equivalent available in some local areas. So again, that's the area that I'm really concentrating on my attention over the next several days, partially because, of course, Willow Creek, which drains that, and the other tributaries up there, they're ice covered. So we still have ice covered streams, and we're going to be sending meltwater in their general direction. There is no hint at this point of a problematic spring rain. You know, like I was talking about those Colorado lows, they're certainly not in the near term forecast. Anything more than 10 days out is really kind of a wish cast more than it is an actual forecast. So what I'm looking at here is, with the nice weather, we should be thawing the ground surface increasingly over the next several days and probably longer. I think it is fair to say that we are in full-on spring melt season right now. What we've had before were some mild run-ups to try and do a spring melt early, but I think we're clearly in the spring melt season right now for pretty much all of North Dakota. Thus far, the up and down weather pattern has been very unlike a typical La Nina. Megan had referenced that earlier, And I absolutely concur. This is not the kind of winter that we expect when we see La Nina affected winters being in our expectations. Usually what the big thing that's missing in a La Nina are warm spells where you melt your snowpack off. And we've had 2 or 3 of them this year, very pronounced ones. And that has led to the frozen ground, obviously. However, any heavy spring rain, and I'm going to be kind of generous with this, over the next 2 to 3 weeks, still possesses the ability to produce an excessive amount of runoff due to the soil conditions. And when I start talking about excessive amount of runoff, I'm not necessarily talking about you're going to create flooding. But what it will do is you get a ½ inch of rain, and you will be surprised at how much runoff is produced from a ½ inch of rain. Because in your mind, you have kind of calibrated over the years, I get a ½ inch of rain, and this is what the creek looks like. In these examples, you get a ½ inch of rain, and the local tributaries and streams may remind you more of something from a 1 inch or an 1.5 inch rain event. So that's kind of the concern going forward. And then looking a little bit longer term, Megan's talking about we're going to be relatively quickly switching over to an El Nino from this La Nina event that we've had. And typically speaking, El Nino weather patterns by late summer will certainly encourage expansion of the drought. Like I say, I have no big concerns right now. I'm relatively happy with the amount of soil moisture we have. There may be some concerns in western North Dakota where livestock dams, dugouts, these human-built water storage for livestock, etc., they maybe haven't filled up. Okay, and given the current forecast, they very well may not fill this spring. And certainly by the time we warm up in our typical summer pattern, we could be seeing some squeaky wheels out there talking about the drought affecting their livestock watering programs. So this is where I think I see the biggest threat coming, is that without consistent rainfall once we get through our snowpack, I do envision with the warmer temperatures in the summertime, especially we're talking about the potential for warmer than normal temperatures, that we can very easily start seeing rapid expansion of the drought. I don't want to call that a forecast, but it is certainly something that is very possible once we get through end of March, and quite honestly, even starting in early mid-April. As soon as we start getting into the growing season, the drought monitor will evolve on a much more regular basis. Technically, it is updated every week on Thursday, but recommendations and stuff are certainly a lot more important as we get into the growing season. Okay, with that, I guess we'll be looking to see if any of you all have any questions for either Megan or myself. And anything else you want to chime in on real quick while we wait for questions?
I don't think so. Yeah, you can just type your questions into the question box, and we've got our information up on the screen, so you can give us a call if you'd rather just call us. You can email us. Yeah, I think as you were talking, I was thinking about how this winter started. It snowed right around Thanksgiving, and we were sitting around going, this is it. This is exactly what we thought was going to happen. And that lasted a few weeks, and that was it.
Yeah, so, we were talking last fall, early last fall and stuff about the La Nina. And last fall was an absolute stereotypical La Nina fall. We typically have that second summer, where October and November are just gorgeous around here. And then we fall off the cliff. And that's exactly what happened. And it was picture perfect La Nina weather pattern right until we melted the snow off in December.
Yep. And that was it. And ever since then, it's been a little weird. I saw we got a question from Steve Robles. Hi, Steve. What would this mean for the wildland fire season for the northwestern part? Yeah, the fire season, that has certainly been getting a lot of attention. I know from our end, we have been working really closely with our state partners as well as the North Dakota Forest Service just to kind of address fire weather concerns. It does seem like this spring is looking like a normal spring fire season. So although it might seem locally like it's been because we don't have any snowpack, but we have been getting enough shots of moisture to at least keep things relatively at bay, to keep it just around normal. Obviously, as we go through the rest of March and April, you can certainly get those days where all of your, fire conditions line up with, really warm temperatures and the low humidity and the strong winds with the frontal passage. So certainly those days will come, and we'll be watching for those. But I think overall, the message that we've been getting, at least from our fire partners as well as the fire weather experts here, because I am not one of them, is that this is looking like a normal spring fire season. So hopefully that answered your question, Steve.
Yeah, and let me chime in here also a little bit for you, Steve. So as you saw in some of my earlier slides, the soil temperatures up around Williston, you only have about 4 inches on average of frost depth around Williston, and it probably decreases the closer we get to Montana, and certainly as you get into Montana. So what this is kind of suggesting to me is that you may see an earlier green up than normal. If we continue to have relatively benevolent weather patterns, I would expect to see our soil temperatures up there continue to climb, and sooner or later we're going to hit the soil temperatures where vegetative growth spurs, and that will probably effectively really end the fire season perhaps a little earlier, because we've already been in the fire danger season right now.
Yeah. I mean, even today we have near critical fire weather conditions across parts of western North Dakota. So yeah, it has already started. We never love an early start to the spring fire season. So we will see how that one goes over the next couple of weeks. I see we have a comment from Ken Thur. Just an FYI, there was significant chat regarding drought impacts this summer on the Extension Ag call. Ag producers are worried about a tough growing producing year this summer.
Yeah, so Ken, this is one of the things that I think has kind of stealthily snuck up on people, and especially in the southwestern part of the state. It is pretty clear that our soil moisture values are better than normal, and I'll stand by that. If you get into south and west of the Missouri River, I think they're going to have a pretty easy transition into the growing season with that soil moisture. Now, that is, of course, like I always refer to as the desert southwest of North Dakota, and they do need to have those consistent spring rains in order to maintain that. But down there, I like their chances. I think once they start digging into the ground, they're going to discover that they might have more moisture than they had initially suspected. Certainly, there will be areas that are quite dry, but overall, the remote sense data does suggest that they should have an at least normal to an above normal prospect for a good start to the growing season. And then once we get started, then you really have to depend on the spring and summer rains to keep the ball rolling. But I think they're going to be good to start with.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, we'll give it another second. Any other questions? I did want to say this webinar is being recorded, so I will work on getting that recording up to our YouTube page and the slides sent out. Hopefully by the end of the day. We'll see how quickly all of that goes with everything else going on. But this information will be shared with all of you. Not seeing anything else, so I think we are good to go.
Good.
Okay, thank you, Alan, for hopping on. And thank you, everybody, for listening in on our webinar. Like we said, please feel free to contact us with any additional questions, and have a great rest of your day.